I speak to you in the name of the one holy and living God. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. 2,500 years ago, third Isaiah, the poet, could have spoken those very words written by Charles Dickens in his Tale for Two Cities. Isaiah could have spoken those words to the Jews who were living in exile in Babylon. 5.5 centuries later, those words are equally applicable to Jesus in his context. Last Thursday evening, our bishops' committee gathered and agreed Charles Dickens' words continue to endure. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was about 8 months ago. We were a people who were preoccupied with buying our airline and theater tickets, planning our next hike, cruise, or family vacation, all good things, but things in God's economy that do not last and ultimately do not satisfy. And just 4 months later, we were a people preoccupied with waiting in long lines and spending inordinate amounts of money on things like bags of rice and beans and tuna fish and mountains of toilet paper. All good things again, but things in God's economy that do not last and ultimately do not satisfy. For the most part, I believe that our initial response to the alarming news of a global pandemic was much like the disciples standing on the shores of Galilee and imploring Jesus, send those people, those crowds away, so they can go shopping and go buy something for themselves to eat. Go store up your survival supplies. It's up to you to take care of yourself. Each man for himself. Jesus will have none of that. Jesus is wise, and he has a different perspective on reality. He speaks with wisdom from his heart. And he says to the disciples, the people need not go away. You. Give them something to eat. Isn't it interesting? I think it is. That 5.5 centuries before Jesus is born, the end of the Babylonian exile, the poet 3rd Isaiah is counseling the Jews about buying and eating bread and milk and wine. You see, the context is for 2 whole generations, many of the Jews have been living far south of Jerusalem in exile in Babylon. Now, during this time, of course, they've created some kind of life for themselves. Many of them have started business. They've accumulated wealth and they're loaning money to the locals. So now the new king, Cyrus, comes along and he frees them. You're free to go now. And many of the Jews are reluctant to leave. Why? Because they've bought a lot of stuff. They've accumulated wealth. Why do they want to go back to Jerusalem, the city that lies in ruin? So, 3rd Isaiah challenges the people. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good. In other words, your tangible resources and wealth are nothing compared to the blessing of being in relationship with God and with your people. Nothing compared to returning to Jerusalem. You see, it's important to remember that the Jews at this time believed that the temple, the ruined temple, was the site of the presence of God. And so now that they're free, they can return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and restore their relationship with the Holy of Holies. Surely, this is more valuable. So the poet's bottom line message is, there is something better than anything you can buy, than all of your wealth. There is something more available to you. And you have to choose. You must decide. Will you leave what is not satisfying behind and return to what is good? Well, here we are, 2,500 years later, and it is the best of times. It's the best of times for stopping the swirl of habitual activity, aimless action, and excessive accumulation. And it's the worst of times. It's the worst of times for being separated from family and friends and experiencing economic and emotional and physical distress. Wisdom swells. We give thoughtful consideration to well-reasoned and heart-warmed words. Foolishness flourishes when we're sucked into the vortex of divisiveness. All that stuff stirred up by the pundits and politicians. Despair breaks our hearts as people die alone, and their loved ones cannot celebrate the lives of the deceased. Hope thrives in the darkness of uncertainty when we choose to see our challenges as opportunities. Opportunities to cultivate the garden of goodness in our shared lives. It is the best of times. It is the worst of times. Here we are, sheltering in place. Sheltering in place has essentially forced us to stop our empty actions and excessive accumulation and habitual activity. You know, recently someone said to me, a real sports fan, he was really surprised that he really does not miss watching his favorite teams play on TV. Something that didn't really last. What do you miss? See, today we have the time, the opportunity to examine our lives in light of our values, to decide what we do and what we do not miss, to let go of things that do not last and hold fast to things that truly satisfy. We have the opportunity to leave behind whatever is not life-giving and cultivate the garden of goodness in our shared lives. 2,500 years ago and today, the message remains the same. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me. Eat what is good, so that you may live. So here we are today, people of God, people of the garden. Let me ask you, will you leave what does not satisfy behind to cultivate our shared garden with all that is good? Will you? Amen.